At 02:11 hours on 14 February 1944, PFC Jacob Salinas lies pressed into the sand beneath the rotting hull of an Italian fishing boat, the timber above him sweating salt and mildew. The time is exact because everything here is measured in beats and breaths. 02:11, the staccato of distant guns, the whisper of a lantern's shudder across a ruined pier. Jacob's face is 6 inches from a carved V notch in the keel where his rifle rests. The wood tastes of old tar and seawater. He breathes low. He does not move. Outside, the night is a physical thing, 41 degrees F, a dampness that beads on his wool collar and crawls down the back of his neck. The Moleta River sluices 200 yards to his left. Every few minutes a ripple takes the moon and spits it back. From the ridge at 312 yards, 7 German observers huddle behind a stone wall, their silhouettes rigid, their 10x80 binoculars like black telescopes. They are not ordinary infantry. They are trained eyes, naval gunfire spotters, practiced at reading smoke and splash. Tonight their signals will steer 170 and 210 shells in arcs that can unmake a beach. Jacob is one man. The odds are simple arithmetic. 7 trained observers and an MG-42 security patch versus 1 PFC, an M1903A4, and a stance no officer in the regiment would tolerate. They have names in his head only, the lead observer with a cigarette stub, a second who keeps rubbing frost into his hands, another who laughs softly when a lantern blinks. The official reports will later call it anomalous attrition. Now it is immediate and raw, 7 trained eyes, 1 cheap sniper, and a line of landing craft waiting in the dark. His rifle is an M1903A4, service issue Springfield in 30-068. 7 pounds stripped 22, 75 inches of barrel, a 4x scope that throws a small black crosshair against blown moonlight. He has zeroed it by feel, by days of testing on a salt-flat range. The scope sits shimmed with cigarette tin and cord so its zero will hold against the saline rot. The butt bone bites into his shoulder. The barrel is cradled in the V-notch, angled upward at 20 degrees, a geometry he learned in the shipyards and on the flats, where a low shot and a steady hip beat any flashy stance taught at Fort Benning. Officers in camp called it cowboy contortionism and wrote notes in logbooks, not doctrine. The men, the ones who oil the engines and gut the fish, call it practical. He calls it a hull cradle reverse prone. Inside the hull the world is narrowed to a few measures. The distance to the wall, 312 yards, the incline of his spine against splintered timber, the curve is exact, 20 degrees in his mind, the pressure on his left shoulder where the rifle rests, the tiny wet ring of cold on his cheek where condensation drips from a plank. He can hear the tooth of the sea working wood, a rat on the opposite side of the hull, and far off, the heavy, hollow thumps of coastal guns, 3 beats and a pause as if the earth were breathing. Every gun report is a countdown. 012, adjust, another volley. Somewhere in the dark, a wounded forward observer coughs and curses under his breath. Jacob's hands smell of oil and salt. His nostrils remember cordite from months before, but there is no cordite here yet, only the metallic tang of old fish and engine grease. Time tightens, a lantern blinks along the German line, a coded flash. Through binoculars they read splashes, they direct, they mark. Jacob knows the math. If they complete their corrections, the next salvo will bracket the next 3 minutes of the pier and 2 landing craft. Hundreds could die. He counts slowly, deliberately, to 6 heartbeats, then to 12. He cants the scope a fraction, aligns crosshair and target, the lead observer, shoulder hunched, cigarette glowing like a smudge of orange. His finger finds the first stage slack, the trigger gives at approximately 25 pounds, a pressure he has trained until it is ceremoniously familiar. The technique is unorthodox because it denies spectacle. There is no upright silhouette, no obvious muzzle flash. The hull's warped planks eat light. A slit of weathered wood masks the muzzle like a hand over a lamp. When he breathes, his ribs press into sand that is cold enough to bite. Sweat gathers at the base of his skull despite the cold. He tastes salt and old iron and the tobacco from the enemy's cigarette. He listens for the MG-42 team shifting their feet, metallic scrape, and a soft curse. He listens for the footstep of reinforcement or the low murmured German count. He exhales. The reticle drifts 1 hair. He waits, 20 degrees of patience. The cigarette embers fall as if on cue. The lead observer turns just enough. Jacob's thumb eases. The spare sling hums under his chin. The world reduces to the clean, surgical report of A3006 through a winter's night. Just as the crosshair settles upon the temple of the lead observer, the plank above his cheek lets loose a single cold drop. The hull smells of mildew and diesel. A distant splash answers the cadence of the heavy guns. He squeezes, cut to black. In the next 150 minutes, everything would change. 7 German observers, a handful of landing craft, and one quiet, reviled stance that the regiment had mocked would rewrite the calculus of a night at Anzio. PFC Jacob Salinas entered the world at 6:42 on June 3, 1918, in a two-room adobe house in Segundo Barrio, El Paso, Texas. The barrio shared a border with the Rio Grande and the Southern Pacific Rail line, and its children learned early to sleep through the tremors of passing locomotives. One freight barreled by every 19 to 23 minutes, shaking chipped plaster from the kitchen wall. Jacob grew up measuring the day by trains, the 09:30 westbound, the 15:48 coal carrier, the 22:6 mixed freight. In a life where nothing was certain except labor, the trains were the closest thing to a clock. His father, Miguel Salinas, worked as a brakeman for Southern Pacific, a job that left his palms blackened and his lungs carrying the faint copper smell of brake dust. Every evening at 18:10, after his 12-hour shift, Miguel dropped a dented metal lunchbox on the soapstone counter and wound the family's single wind-up clock by 30 half-turns. He carried a pocket watch that always ran 5 minutes slow, something he claimed was a buffer against fate. Jacob would sit cross-legged at his feet, listening to the tick of gears and learning the small rituals of maintenance. Oil a hinge once a week, splice a rope with 7 tight wraps, measure a lever's distance by thumb length. His mother, Rosa, rose at 04:15 for her cannery shift. Her world was the sharp smell of tomatoes, the sound of conveyor belts, the rhythm of tin lids clattering into bins. Her hands were always warm from steam, even in winter. Jacob remembered her humming at night, a low, steady tone that kept his nerves anchored long after childhood. By age 12, he had already learned the practical lessons of a working-class life. Fix things before they break, make things last, speak only when necessary. He showed little interest in school and even less in books, but he had a knack for mechanics. When a neighbor's pump jammed, Jacob found the gravel in the valve by smell alone, a metallic grit mixed with rainwater. When a fence needed reinforcing, he figured out that a diagonal brace at 27 degrees held better than a vertical one. He lived in a world of angles, weights, tensions, the building blocks of marksmanship long before he touched a rifle. Jacob left school at 14 and took his first summer job on a shrimp trawler off Galveston Bay, working under a shipwright named Emilio Reyes. Emilio ran a tight deck. Slack, boy, is the enemy. Slack sinks boats and men. Jacob learned to coil rope in perfect figure eights, to gauge humidity by the feel of the oars, and to weld a cracked bracket in wind gusts without letting the flame gutter. The trawlers were small, 30-foot wooden vessels with hull planks that flexed under pressure. Jacob spent hours lying beneath their bellies, wedging oak slats into warped seams and hammering them into place with a mallet. He learned where condensation gathered, always along the seam that ran just below the bow's midpoint, and how soft the wood felt after a week of high tides. He slept under hulls during storms, learning how sound traveled through their bodies. A wave could mask a whisper, a crosswind could carry a hammer tap 30 yards farther than expected. These were useless facts to most people. To Jacob, they were the earliest form of reconnaissance. By 17, he divided his time between shrimping and hunting jackrabbits in the scrub outside El Paso. The hunting taught him patience. Rabbits bolted in sudden arcs, unpredictable unless you learned their patterns. Jacob practiced a low, hip-rotated firing stance to avoid casting a silhouette above the brush. He studied angles, how a 1-inch shift of his left foot could alter his sightline by 2 degrees across 100 yards. He practiced every Sunday with a battered bolt action. 22, squeezing the trigger until he could predict the exact moment the sear would break. His dry fire routine was obsessive, 50 squeezes at dawn, 50 at dusk. After work, he shot from under fence rails, under wagon frames, under anything that forced him to lower his profile. He wasn't trying to innovate, he was trying to survive. Everything in his upbringing had taught him that glory was a word for people who never worked with their hands. Shipwright Emilio saw promise in him. In 1937, he promoted Jacob unofficially. "You're better with a plane than I am," he grumbled, and trusted him with tasks usually reserved for seasoned carpenters. Jacob learned the modular logic of hulls, how a 1/4-inch warp over 10 feet created a half-inch light gap, how a boat hummed when the tide was rising, how pressure traveled across planks in gentle arcs. Every one of these lessons would one day become part of Jacob's unorthodox firing stance. By age 22, Jacob could strip and reassemble a Johnson outboard engine in 12 minutes flat, and he could mend a hull panel with nothing but a wedge, rope, and a sharp blade. His hands were permanently nicked, and his forearms carried the faint scent of tar that no soap could scrub away. These were not military skills, but war has a way of finding uses for everything a man has ever done. Jacob heard about Pearl Harbor while repairing a torn net in a loft above the docks on December 7, 1941, at 19:14. Someone down on the pier shouted for the radio, words broken by static. Bombed burning Pearl Harbor, the foreman shut off all work, and the men gathered around a small transistor. Jacob stood with his hands dripping salt water, listening to a world shift direction. Within 11 days, on December 18, he enlisted at the El Paso recruiting office. The medical exam was clinical, height 59. Weight 155 lb. Blood pressure 128/82. Version 2030 corrected to 2020. Serial number assigned US34217. His father didn't try to stop him. He simply placed his pocket watch in Jacob's hand and said, "Set it 5 minutes slow. That way you'll never be late for death." Basic training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, began on January 5, 1942. Jacob adapted quickly to the routines: reveille at 05:30, drill at 06:0, marksmanship at 09:0. He excelled in rifle training, qualifying sharpshooter with 192-200 on February 20. His instructors noticed something odd. Jacob's prone position wasn't regulation. Instead of keeping elbows wide and body flat, he angled his hips slightly and placed more weight through his shoulder blades than his arms. It looked wrong, almost backward, but his groups were tight. A lieutenant approached him after a session. "Private Salinas, what is that posture?" "Sir, it's what helps me shoot steady." "The manual disagrees." "Yes, sir." Jacob didn't argue. He simply reverted to the standard stance whenever officers were present, then returned to his own method when practicing alone. He shipped out with the 3rd Infantry Division, 15th Infantry Regiment, Item Company, arriving at Fort Bragg on March 12, 1942. From there, the unit embarked for the Mediterranean, leaving New York Harbor on July 2, 1943 under convoy UGS-12. They landed in Oran, Algeria on July 18. Jacob saw his first artillery barrage on July 28, 1943, at 3:47 near Sicily. The mortar that hit 14 yards from his foxhole taught him how sound behaves just before impact: the rising wail, the collapsing pause, the unavoidable thump in the chest. It also taught him how to stay absolutely still. His squadmates learned quickly that Jacob wasn't a talker. He listened more than he spoke, worked more than he rested, and fixed whatever broke: rifles, rations, crates, morale. They called him Salty because he always smelled faintly of sea brine. One private, Ortiz, renamed him El Barquero, the boatman, after watching Jacob slide under a beach skiff during training to retrieve a jammed canteen. His closest connection in the unit was Corporal Frank "Mac" McGreevy, a Cincinnati native with a mechanic's hands and a smoker's lungs. Mac noticed the cigarette tins Jacob collected. "You building a robot?" he joked. "Just shims," Jacob replied. Jacob later used those tins to fine-tune his Scope 0. The officers, however, viewed him differently. His firing stance drew criticism in October 1943 during a live-fire drill near the Italian coast. Captain Leeds confronted him. "Captain Leeds, Private, what in God's name are you doing?" "Jacob, stabilizing, sir." "Leeds, it looks like a circus trick. You'll stand corrected." "Jacob, yes, sir." But the correction didn't last. That night, Jacob returned to the derelict fishing shanty and practiced in the shadows. Mac timed him. His follow-up shot speed decreased from 4.2 seconds to 2.1 seconds when he used his unorthodox stance. The V-notch carved into the hull steadied the barrel in a way sandbags never did. 2 official reports recorded his misconduct. Range Officer's Memo, 12/11/43. Salinas employs non-regulation stance, discouraged. Company Commander's Journal, 12/13/43. Private creative but undisciplined. But the enlisted men trusted results over doctrine. They began asking Jacob to check their rifles, to align their sights, to teach them how to breathe. One even tried to imitate Jacob's stance and fell flat on his back, much to the squad's amusement. Jacob said nothing. He kept working, he kept practicing at night, carving a new V-notch every time the old hulls rotted through. Winter 1944 in Italy was a cold that cut straight through bone. On January 28, Item Company received orders relocating them to the Anzio beachhead. They moved before dawn, stepping through mud that clung like cement. The convoy reached its position at 7:45 on January 30, just as the fog lifted enough to reveal the shattered shoreline. The beachhead was a patchwork of trenches, wreckage, and fishermen's huts. Jacob immediately noticed the hulls, dozens of overturned boats scattered along the coast. He ran his hand along one and felt the soft grain, the warped planks, the familiar contours. They were nearly identical to the boats he had worked on in Galveston. He felt, for the first time in months, something like clarity. Temperatures hovered between 39 degrees F and 46 degrees F in early February. Humidity remained above 75%, making every breath heavy, every uniform damp. Visibility fluctuated between 200 and 250 yards when the fog rolled in around 20. Jacob memorized these numbers because they shaped the ranges he would have to shoot. The Germans held the high ground inland. Their spotters, elite naval artillery observers, had been picking off Allied engineers and directing devastating fire onto the beaches. On February 10, 2 U.S. forward observers from Jacob's regiment were killed by precision shelling. Command needed someone who could strike back quietly, reliably, and without exposing a position. Mac looked at Jacob. "Hull work, huh? Looks like home for you." "Jacob, yes, it does." On February 13, 2340, Jacob lay under a hull for the first time in this theater, carving a fresh V-notch with his knife. He worked methodically, feeling the grain, following the curve. The wind smelled of salt, tar, and cordite from distant guns. He knew, without being told, that the next night he would be sent to counter the German spotter threat. And everything he had ever learned, every tide read, every hull repaired, every low-hip shot squeezed in the dust of Texas, would be tested. War at Anzio had a geometry to it, a cruel, predictable geometry, and the Germans understood it better than the Americans did. U.S. doctrine in early 1944 required snipers to fire from elevated or semi-elevated positions, sandbagged berms, or improvised towers built atop crates. These positions were designed for clear sightlines, controlled fields of fire, and rapid re-engagement. They made sense on paper. They made sense in Kansas, where the manuals were written. They did not make sense in Anzio. On the beachhead, anything above 18 inches of elevation turned a man into a silhouette against the pale Italian sky. A sniper raising his head even 3 fingerwidths above a sandbag could be spotted by the German observers perched on the inland ridge. Those observers operated with 10 times 80 Flakfenroer binoculars, capable of resolving a man's hand from 350 yards away in low light. The Germans knew where the Americans were supposed to stand, kneel, and fire. Doctrine made Americans predictable. Predictability made them dead. 3 times in the week before Jacob's mission, U.S. snipers attempted overwatch using manual-sanctioned positions. 3 times the gunfire spotters either countersniped them or bracketed the position for artillery strike. The artillery didn't even need a direct hit. The concussion alone could kill or maim a man within a 5-yard radius. Jacob had watched this silently. He saw the same flawed pattern repeating. A man would lift himself to a standard prone, expose his shoulders, muzzle, and scope glint, and within 3 to 6 minutes, a high-velocity round or shell fragment would answer. The flash of the M1903A4 was especially damning. In 75% humidity, muzzle flash refracted off particulate haze, making it flare like a match struck in a cellar. Even a cut sunshade could not fully suppress the cone. The Germans adapted with terrifying precision. They swept the beaches with optical grids. They trained their glass directly at the angles American doctrine insisted were optimal. And every time an American followed the manual, he stepped into the crosshairs of someone who had already calculated his death. Jacob measured the angles. The standard overwatch elevation placed the rifle barrel at roughly a 610-degree incline, depending on terrain. That incline gave the Germans a perfect target, a triangular silhouette with a predictable apex. His mind compared that shape to the curve of a hull plank, the warped light spaces beneath a boat, places doctrine didn't consider. Places the Germans wouldn't think to check. He tried to explain it once to Mac, tracing the angles in the sand. "They're hunting shadows," Jacob said, "and we keep offering them the same shadow." The flaw was systemic, and it was killing his men. The numbers were not abstract. They had names, faces, jokes, bad habits, and families waiting on the far side of the ocean. The cost of doctrine had a pulse. PFC Daniel Danny Ruiz, age 20, San Antonio, killed 17 on February 8, 1944. Danny had been arranging sandbags, positioning his Springfield as the manual dictated. A single German spotter round, a 7.92 times 57 mm fired from somewhere between 290 and 320 yards, punched through his sternum. The sound was so soft that men 50 feet away didn't realize he'd been hit until he collapsed. His rifle fell with the safety still engaged. The blood froze in a perfect arc on the cold sand. Jacob helped carry the body to the aid station. Danny's wrist still wore the braided thread bracelet he'd made during the Atlantic crossing. Jacob didn't remove it. Corporal James H. McCready, age 26, Akron. Killed 741 on February 9. McCready never fired a shot, he hadn't even raised his rifle. The Germans, anticipating an overwatch attempt from that vantage, had triangulated sound from a previous American attempt and pre-sighted a mortar. When McCready set his ammo box down, one soft clink of metal on stone, the shell landed 8 feet behind him. A single fragment severed his carotid artery. He died kneeling, eyes open, as if still preparing to shoot. Sergeant Roland Kessler, age 31, Brooklyn, killed 16-3 on February 10. Kessler had survived North Africa and Sicily. He was the kind of man who seemed unkillable, big hands, gravel voice, a laugh that rolled like a dropped barrel. He stuck his head out from behind a shattered fishing hut to check wind direction. The Germans were waiting. The shot entered his left temple, exited beneath his ear, and shattered the plank behind him. His journal was recovered from his coat. The last entry read, "They see us long before we see them." Jacob read the line 3 times. It wasn't defeatist, it was diagnostic. The 4th death broke him. Private Louis Ontiveros, age 19. Ontiveros had been the closest thing Jacob had to a student. After seeing Jacob practice his low, Hull-inspired stance, Ontiveros had tried to adopt it. He was clumsy at first, but he learned quickly. He could have survived. But during a training review, an officer forced Ontiveros to demonstrate the correct prone position. Regulation posture, elevated elbows, clear silhouette. Ontiveros obeyed because he was young, scared, and trusting that officers knew best. At 18:50 on February 12, Ontiveros was hit in the abdomen by a round that dropped in from a high angle. Jacob recognized the trajectory immediately. A German spotter had fired from the ridge. He found Ontiveros half-conscious, soaked in blood. The tide was pushing closer, washing cold foam around the boy's boots. Mac knelt on the opposite side. Ontiveros whispered, "Shoulda stayed low, Jake." "A cough, the winds. They made me sit up, shoulda stayed low." He died minutes later, hand squeezed around Jacob's fingers, sand sticking to his lips. Jacob didn't speak for hours. The fury was quiet, not the kind that roared, but the kind that sharpened. The night Ontiveros died, Jacob stood alone near the waterline, his boots sinking half an inch with each wave. The sea was slate-colored under the moon. The horizon blinked with distant artillery flashes, a silent strobing of the war beyond. Jacob replayed the angle of the German shot in his mind. It had come from approximately 305 yards, descending at roughly a 9-degree angle. That angle corresponded exactly to one of the vantage points he'd mapped earlier, a suspected observation nest halfway up the ridge. Doctrine had failed. It hadn't just failed tactically, it had failed personally. If Jacob had been allowed to teach his stance, Ontiveros would have been invisible to that spotter. He clenched his jaw hard enough that the muscles ached. Salt dried on his cheek. His hands still smelled faintly of copper and sand. The wind cut through his coat, carrying a trace of diesel from a wrecked barge. He made a decision then, silently, privately, in the cold Italian dark. He would never again let a regulation kill one of his men. Before Jacob broke the rules, he tried twice to work within them. Attempt 1, February 12, 23. He approached Lieutenant Harris, the by-the-book officer whose boots were always polished even in mud. Jacob stood at attention. "Sir, I have a proposal." Harris didn't look up from his field map. "Make it quick." "What?" Jacob explained the hull cradle concept. Zero silhouette, stabilized barrel, reduced muzzle flash signature, unpredictable angle. Harris blinked once. "Salinas, what you're describing is folk engineering. This is the army." "We use doctrine." "Sir, doctrine's getting men killed." The lieutenant stiffened. "You're out of line, Private." Harris dismissed him with a flick of the hand. Later, he logged the conversation as unproductive. "What?" Attempt 2, February 13, 14, 20. Jacob tried again, this time with Captain Leeds, the company commander. The captain listened longer but cared less. "Jacob, sir, I can take out the spotters. But not with standard positions. I need to work under the hulls." "Leeds, your technique isn't sanctioned." "Jacob, it works." "Leeds, if it worked, the manual would include it." "Jacob, sir." "Leeds dismissed, Private." "What?" The captain's log later read, "Salinas continues to demonstrate stubbornness regarding non-regulation firing posture." Jacob walked out without saluting, not in disrespect, but because his hands were shaking. He didn't trust himself to raise them. By 23:40 on February 13, Jacob had accepted what the army refused to. Official channels were dead ends. He worked quietly under one of the fishermen's hulls, sanding the interior curve with a scrap of canvas, carving a second V-notch with the tip of his bayonet. He shaped it by feel, running his thumb across each groove until the curve aligned with the natural fall line of the wood. The fishing hull Jacob chose on the night of February 14, 1944, was longer than the others, 17 feet 4 inches from splintered bow to stern, with a keel thickness of 125 inches. The curve of its belly was perfect. Years of tide rot had warped the wood just enough to create a natural arch, a shallow cavity only a man willing to crawl through mud and mildew would ever consider home. He lit no light. He needed none. His hands worked by memory, tracing the wood grain like old scars. Jacob set the rifle aside and took his bayonet, beginning slow, controlled strokes. He carved a 1/8 cm V-notch into the underside of the hull, exactly where the curve peaked. He shaved the notch deeper by 0.5 millimeter until its angles matched the contour of his barrel. He pressed the Springfield into it. Perfect fit. He carved a second groove, the follow-up channel, Mac called it, a shallow arc to reset the barrel after recoil. Then he tore a strip from his wool undershirt, wrapping it into the seam between the planks. When he pressed the rifle down, the wool dampened the vibration. Another lesson from the shrimp boats: cloth quiets wood better than rope. Jacob smelled brine, tar, and rotting varnish. The inside of the hull was damp. Beads of condensation rolled from plank to plank, collecting in small pockets that smelled faintly of dead fish. His hands were raw from scraping, splinters embedded in his palm. He didn't remove them. Next came the rifle. He removed the bolt, wiping it with 3 drops of reclaimed outboard oil, the same oil he once used to keep the Rosario II's engine humming. He felt the smooth glide as he reinserted it. He ran a strip of oiled cloth through the bore in 5 exact passes, the 5th always the cleanest. He tightened the scope rings to a torque he didn't measure with tools, only with experience, the same resistance he used when binding hull cleats. He checked the trigger. He pressed until the break came clean and sharp, approximately 2 5-pounds. The same feel he'd trained into his finger over a decade earlier under the hot Texas sun. He was building something the Army had never designed, never wanted, never imagined, a firing system hidden inside the skeleton of a drowned boat, a place no doctrine could predict. He wasn't rebelling, he was repairing. Like every broken thing he'd coaxed back into function. Testing began at 0:40. Fog clung low to the sand, the air heavy and cold enough to make breath visible in faint wisps. Mac stood watch 10 yards away, silent, arms crossed. He didn't ask questions. He understood that whatever Jacob was doing had already crossed a threshold no officer would approve. Jacob lay beneath the hull, spine pressed against damp earth. The scent of mildew was so strong it felt alive. The V-notch cupped the barrel perfectly. The rifle became an extension of the hull, and the hull became an extension of Jacob's chest. He sighted on a scrap metal plate 147 yards inland, a rusted hatch cover propped against a broken wall. The reticle steadied, the world narrowed. He fired, crack. The shot echoed differently under the hull, muted, compressed, almost swallowed. Mac leaned forward slightly, but Jacob remained still. He shifted his hips 3 centimeters to adjust recoil absorption, noting how the barrel returned faster to the second groove. He fired again, then again, 5 shots total. He crawled out and walked to the hatch plate. The group was tight, striking within 1/4 inches, half the spread he normally achieved on open ground. Behind the hull, muzzle flash was nearly invisible. The planks swallowed the flare just as Jacob had hoped. Mac gave 2 taps on his canteen, his quiet way of saying this will work. The rest would be up to Jacob alone. At 1:10, an engineer jogged breathlessly toward Item Company's forward line, carrying a coded radio sheet. He didn't bother with formalities. 7 German artillery observers, he said. Grid 14F. They're adjusting fire for the 170s and 210s inland. We're about to get flattened. The next corrected salvo was expected in 12 minutes. Each salvo, if perfectly bracketed, could kill 120 men on the beachhead. Engineers repairing landing craft, medics tending to wounded, infantry preparing positions. A sergeant pulled Jacob aside, his voice low, urgent. Buy us time, however you can. Not an order, not permission, something in between. The odds were stark. Jacob, 1 rifle, 1 hull, 1 stance no one approved of. Enemy, 7 trained artillery observers. Their protection, MG-42 team, 60-80 yards behind them. Visibility, 230 yards due to ground fog. Wind 46 mph SW. Jacob checked his watch. 0:29, time to move. He slid beneath the hull, felt the sand dampen his elbows, positioned the rifle. Controlled his breathing, pressed his cheek to the wood until he could smell old seawater and oil. He became the hull. At 0:2:11, the world aligned. 140 minutes of precise, methodical killing. A faint form gap between planks granted a sliver of the ridge. Through it, the lead German observer came into view, rigid posture, binoculars lifted, the faint glow of a shuttered lantern behind him. 312 yards. Jacob calculated automatically. Elevation +02 mil. Wind 04 mil left hold. Temperature 41 degrees F. Humidity 78%. He exhaled, his ribs pressed into cold sand. At 2:12:6 he squeezed. The round struck the observer's right temple, a clean kill. The man's legs folded neatly beneath him. No alarm, not yet. Jacob didn't move. The Germans assumed artillery shrapnel. One of them knelt over the body. The MG-42 team scanned the wrong sectors, searching the beach instead of the boats. At 02:18, another observer lifted binoculars. Jacob adjusted by 0.1 mils, compensating for fog thickening over the field. The second shot broke at 02:18:44. It hit just below the left eye socket. The man fell backward, a gasp swallowed by wind. A staccato burst from the MG-42 tore through open sand, stitching a line 33-45 feet from Jacob's hull. He felt the vibration through the ground. Tiny splinters rained from the hull roof, dusting his back. He smothered a cough in his sleeve. Stillness was life. Fog fluctuated, visibility rising and falling from 210 to 260 yards. Jacob waited, breathing in the rhythm of distant surf. Third observer exposed the top of his binocular housing at 02:27. Jacob fired. The round shattered the lenses and entered his skull. Fourth observer, crawling to adjust field telephone wire at 02:41. Jacob placed the reticle over the base of his neck. One shot, down. Fifth observer, sprinting to replace previous positions, crouched under a stone lip. Jacob tracked him through shifting mist. The shot landed at 02:59. The German team was unraveling, voices pitched higher, lantern signals irregular. They still could not locate Jacob's firing angle. One pointed toward the dunes, another toward the pier. None pointed toward the rotting hull. The MG-42 team poured a 28-second burst into every suspicious shadow. The weapon's teeth-rattling roar ripped across the beach. Sand erupted in violent sprays. One round clipped the hull's lowest plank, carving a shallow groove inches from Jacob's shoulder. He remained motionless. The hull absorbed the shock like a second ribcage. 4 minutes of silence followed, then movement. Observer 6 crawled toward a new vantage point, exposing his left side. Jacob steadied the reticle, compensating for breath, wind, fog. He fired. The bullet severed an artery in the man's shoulder. He collapsed in a growing stain of dark earth. One left. The last observer broke. He abandoned the ridgeline, sprinting downslope toward the MG-42 team. Panic made him careless. He ran in a straight line. Jacob tracked him at 23 mph, adjusting mill hold to 0.6 for motion and slight elevation change. He fired at 3:33:12. The round struck the base of the man's skull. He fell instantly, body crumpling mid-stride. The battlefield exhaled. Jacob listened. No German voices, no binocular shutter clicks, no lantern codes, only the distant percussion of artillery now firing blind. Allied engineers confirmed within minutes. Accuracy drop, 70% decrease. Bracketing fire ceased entirely. Spotter network neutralized. The tide shifted. Jacob did not leave the hull until 04:31. His back was soaked with condensation, his fingers numb, his heartbeat slow and steady, the aftermath hitting him only when he felt safe enough to feel it all. Mac waited beside the hull, rifle slung, boots wet. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. One nod, a shared breath, a quiet understanding that the night had changed more than just coordinates on a map. The beachhead stabilized by dawn. Engineers emerged from trenches with disbelief in their voices. Officers studied the bodies on the ridge and debated whether multiple shooters had participated. Jacob said nothing. He sat on an overturned crate while Mac disassembled his Springfield, wiping the bolt clean, resetting each component with delicate, almost reverent motions. Jacob's hands began to shake only after the rifle was taken from them. He walked back toward the tide line, knelt, and drew 3 letters in the sand with his fingertip. L.O. Louis Ontiveros. The sea reclaimed the letters within minutes. Jacob didn't redraw them. Some things were meant to fade quietly. Dawn came slowly to Anzio on February 14, 1944, bleeding gray light across the beachhead. The first artillery shells of the morning fell wide, not just a little wide, but wildly, incomprehensibly off target. Engineers who had spent the last week bracing for death stood from their trenches, blinking at the sky as explosions churned mud and seawater far from their positions. At 6:10, a communications runner sprinted across the sand, waving a clipboard. Shelling S off, they've lost their eyes. Word spread fast among the enlisted ranks. Something had changed, drastically, decisively. The precision that had pinned them for days was gone. German fire that normally fell with knife-edge accuracy now smashed open water or distant scrub, detonating harmlessly against empty ridges. A corporal from Baker Company walked the trench line shouting, "Somebody got their spotters, I swear it's true." By 070, a patrol was dispatched to check the ridge. It took them an hour to reach the crest. The fog was still lifting when they found the first body. Within another 20 minutes they had found all 7, each one placed across a 90-yard front, frozen in postures of duty abruptly ended. 4 still clutched binoculars, 2 held field telephone receivers, 1 lay half-turned as if he had been running. The patrol descended shaken. "That wasn't artillery," one soldier muttered. "That was deliberate. That was someone hunting hunters." But who? Officers convened an informal inquiry. None believed a lone American sniper could have executed all 7 kills. Leeds theorized, most likely combined suppressive fire or collateral from friendly bombardment. Even as he said it, he looked unconvinced. Enlisted men had their own explanation. Word whispered through tents and foxholes, the ghost under the hulls. "Some boy from Texas did it. I heard he never even showed his head." The rumor web tightened by evening. Mac spoke only to 2 NCOs and only once. It was Salinas, just Salinas. They believed him. History, however, would be less accommodating. Numbers rarely tell a story by themselves, but the numbers at Anzio told one too dramatic to ignore. Within 48 hours of the 7 observers being neutralized, artillery casualties on the beachhead dropped by 42%. German hit percentage on registered targets fell from 31% to 9%. Number of correctly bracketed salvos, 0. Engineers completed 3 major repairs, including the reinforcement of landing craft 33B, because shelling no longer pinned them. Infantry movements increased by 28%, reflecting regained confidence in maneuver. The artillery officers on the German side were equally confused. One intercept captured days later read, "Accuracy severely degraded, observation posts compromised, cause unknown." Jacob filled out an after-action slip, brief and undramatic. "Enemy observers neutralized. Recommend exploration of low-angle concealed firing positions using natural structures." Command stamped it received and filed it without comment, but for the men on the ground, the change in survival odds was immediate and priceless. Recognition in war is not distributed evenly. It is filtered through bureaucracy, through politics, through the simple reality that some stories fit official doctrine and others do not. Jacob's story did not. Captain Leeds prepared a statement the following morning, a narrow and deliberately vague commendation citing initiative under duress during counter-observation operations. It did not mention innovation, nor unorthodox methods, nor the 7 confirmed kills. It avoided specifics. It avoided credit. Higher command reviewed Leeds's report and ignored the suggestion that unconventional firing methods had played a role. The margin note from battalion read, "No further dissemination of non-regulation postures, unsafe, unverified results." Jacob received no medal, no citation, no handshake from a general. Not even a line in the daily operations summary beyond, "Observer threat reduced." When Mac privately mentioned to Leeds that Jacob had likely carried out the entire action alone, the captain stiffened. "If that's true, Corporal, then it's officially untrue, understood." Mac nodded, jaw tight. Officers aren't villains in war, they're protectors of procedure. Procedure didn't know what to do with a man like Jacob Salinas. The Germans, however, understood exactly what had happened. Intercepted radio traffic from the ridge revealed, sniper origin undetermined, no flash observed, conclude ground-level concealment or tunnel. Do not expose observation assets beyond 7 seconds. Movement inland recommended to avoid hull-shaped silhouettes. Hull-shaped silhouettes, they had learned too late where Jacob had been. In the days following the incident, German spotter teams relocated deeper into the hills. They began using triangulation before raising binoculars. MG-42 teams were ordered to fire at any overturned hulls that resembled Jacob's hide. The battlefield had shifted. A single night under a derelict fishing boat had forced a professional enemy to rewrite their tactics. Doctrine bends under pressure. Skill outlasts doctrine. The war ended. History marched on. Files were boxed. Names misplaced, reports misinterpreted or folded into broader narratives. Jacob returned to Texas in December 1945, stepping off a transport ship with his duffel thrown over one shoulder. The air smelled different from Italy, warmer, fuller, with the dusty sweetness of mesquite and the syrupy scent of Gulf humidity. Within a week, he was back on Galveston Bay. The Rosario II was still afloat. Its hull needed repairs. Jacob inspected it the way a surgeon inspects a patient, tapping boards, running his hands along warped lines, inhaling the brine-soaked grain. He took a job as assistant shipwright again. The pay was modest. The work was familiar. Coworkers sometimes found him asleep under a dry-docked hull, hands folded across his chest, expression serene. Salinas's tent, they joked. He rarely laughed, but he didn't mind the nickname. He never talked about the 7 observers, not once, not to neighbors, not to coworkers, not even to Mac, who wrote him from Ohio once a year. Jacob responded rarely, though he kept every letter in a tin box under his bed. He never collected his rifle. It stayed in Army possession, reissued, lost, or scrapped, no one knows. He never asked for it back. Jacob lived quietly, aging into a man whose hands grew stiff from decades of plain work and caulking. He walked with the slight stoop of someone who'd spent half his life beneath boats. He married late, a widow named Maria who worked the cannery line like Jacob's mother once had. They had no children, but they shared a garden, a porch, and an uncomplicated peace. Jacob died in 1973, heart failure in his sleep, in a small house a few blocks from where he grew up. No military ceremony, no folded flag, only a modest funeral attended by neighbors, fishermen, and 3 aging veterans who remembered him as the quiet one who always fixed things. No one mentioned the night at Anzio. War heroes are often loud in the stories we tell, but some are quiet, so quiet the world nearly forgets they existed. Jacob's innovation never made it into the official manuals. It never bore his name. It never appeared in field doctrine, training pamphlets, or awards lists, but legacy does not depend on paperwork. In March 1944, 2 NCOs from the 3rd Division circulated an unofficial memo, a hand-copied set of notes titled Low-Profile Concealment Techniques for Counter-Sniping. The memo described slit aperture firing, low-angle prone positions, ground-level concealment inside natural or improvised shelter, methods for eliminating muzzle flash visibility. None of the notes credited Jacob, but